Allora, grazie a tutti di esserci. Io sono figura di sfondo di guerriglia e niente, stasera abbiamo con noi Asa Winstanley, che è un giornalista di Electronic Intifada, nonché conduttore del podcast della testata, co-conduttore. Da anni si occupa della causa palestinese e di politica interna britannica. Inoltre è stato tra i primi a intervistare Corbyn quando si è candidato alla leadership del Partito Laburista e soprattutto, poi il motivo per cui l'abbiamo invitato, ultimamente ha scritto un libro molto interessante su come le false accuse di antisemitismo siano state usate per rimuovere Corbyn dalla posizione di leadership. Ha anche un Patreon che consiglio ovviamente e metteremo nei link. Allora, ciao Asa, welcome to Guerriglia Radio and thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, first of all, congratulations on your book, because
Thank you.
I read that the first print, it's already been sold out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's doing pretty well, it seems. I mean, it's a small publisher, you know, it doesn't have it's called All Books, so it's an American publisher. It doesn't have the reach of the big conglomerates, but, you know, it's doing pretty well, and I'm pretty happy with it, and there's been quite a big response to it.
Yes, you know, I was wondering if it's, let's say, I was expecting your book to come out from Verso or from other more, let's say, well-known publishers in the UK. That wasn't the case. I mean, have you tried to publish them also on Verso or not?
Well, I can say that I tried. I sent the manuscript to 46 publishers and agents, and not a single British publisher was willing to publish it. Or and this included the radical publishers too. So, you know, you can draw your own conclusions from
Not
that.
that radical.
Yeah. Well, yeah, there we go. So, I mean, I think it's a sign of how successful really the anti-Semitism witch hunt was, and it still is, that there was this great amount of fear. You know, I mean, look, I was given all sorts of reasons that people didn't want to publish the book, and some of them may have been valid. There was one publisher who, this was during COVID, who was a bit scared of going out of business. But, you know, one publisher told me that there wouldn't be a market for the book. Well, you know, that was clearly not true.
Not the case, no. Okay. And going back to the book, I mean, it focuses mainly on British politics, but I believe that could be of interest also for people here in Italy and other parts of the world. That's right. For multiple reasons. Well, first of all, because many things come from the UK. It's not the cultural powerhouse they used to be, but, you know, some, you know, social and cultural phenomena that happen in the UK tend to reverberate also in other countries. And
like Operation Gladio.
Oh, yes, I believe that's, you know,
trained by the SAS.
Yeah. Well, we could talk a lot about Gladio. We did several episodes also talking about that. But, you know, also in politics, I was hoping while it was happening that Corbyn Labour could have been, you know, could have started a new wave of leftist electoral politics, more in a sort of fashion that Blair and Clinton did in the 90s, but not in a horrible, dreadful way, you know, as Blair and Clinton, but in a good way. And that's reason one. Secondly, because I believe that it could be considered a case study of what to do and especially what not to do in similar cases. And also, lastly, but definitely not least, because baseless accusations of anti-Semitism are widely used by Zionists to shut down conversation and smear people. So, you know, that's the main besides it's a lovely book, also quite gripping. I really
Cute.
liked your writing style. Like, at the end of some chapters, like, but will this happen? Leaving these sentences was like, we knew that it didn't, but, so in order, we're speaking to an Italian audience. So who is Jeremy Corbyn? Is he the dangerous Bolshevik that Murdoch Media and BBS portrayed him to be? Or is it just a mild-mannered, decent man of the left?
Yeah, unfortunately, he wasn't a dangerous Bolshevik. Jeremy Corbyn was and still is a very nice man. He's a social democrat at heart, really. This is what it comes down to. And his policies weren't really radical. His policies were essentially moderate to leftish social democratic policies, which would have been at home in any Labour Party manifesto prior to the 1980s. And for that matter, they would have even been at home in many even Conservative Party manifestos prior to Margaret Thatcher, when there was still some sort of national political consensus around at least having a minimal welfare state and the NHS and certain industries being nationalised and owned and operated by government control. But what Corbyn's domestic policies represented was a break with the neoliberal consensus that has dominated for more than 4 decades. So it would have been a complete reversal of the direction of travel, that is, away from privatizing more and more things and to start to bring certain industries under government control. Just simple things like the water companies being
the railways also,
the railways,
I remember stuff.
Exactly, things like this. So he wasn't a radical, but what his international policies were considered to be especially a threat because he's part of the peace movement. He's been a leading part of the anti-war movement for many decades, and part of solidarity movements with oppressed peoples around the world, including the Palestinians.
In fact, if I may, many draw a comparison between Corbyn. I believe that it's quite an inappropriate comparison, but many people draw a comparison between Corbyn and Sanders. But Sanders is an ultra mild social democrat, and at core he's an imperialist. I mean, the good face of the empire, but still the empire.
Yeah.
While in fact, the main difference with Corbyn is that he's an internationalist and a decent man at heart. I mean, he doesn't have any sort of also celebration of what was the British Empire, which,
that's right.
It was part of Labour culture because, a lot of often in Italy, people have I believe, a warped perception of what the Labour Party actually is, because it's not the equivalent of what in Italy was the Partito Comunista Italiano.
No.
But it was an establishment party.
Yes.
And also there was something, well, we all know what happened in the end, and in the meanwhile, with all the expulsions of party members and then also Corbyn. But there are some precedents. I believe you're familiar with, and this is a story between, Labour Party and the Italian Communist Party. The story of Platts Mills in 1948, the Nenni Telegram. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
I don't think so, no.
Okay. Platts Mills was a Labour politician. Was elected in the House of Parliament, and in 1948, I believe you know that there was this huge election between the Socialists and the Democrazia Cristiana, the Christian Democrats, and the head of the Socialist and Communist Alliance was Pietro Nenni. And those elections were rigged by the United States. I mean, It's a historical fact.
Yeah.
And Platts Mills sent a telegram in solidarity to Nenni, to Pietro Nenni in solidarity, expressing his solidarity and saying essentially that the election was stolen and were rigged. And for that, he was expelled from the Labour Party. So,
interesting. No, of course I'd heard about the CIA rigging that Italian election, but I didn't know about that expelled Labour Party leader. That's interesting. Yeah.
History repeats itself.
Indeed, and that it's part of kind of a long tradition. I think for your Italian listeners, the thing to say about the British Labour Party is that it has always been part of for the vast majority of its history, let's say, it's been part of very much part of the British establishment. And not only was it and is it pro-imperialist in theory, it was actually at certain periods actually running the British Empire when the British Empire was, yes, it was kind of in its declining decades, the 1940s and 1950s, but nonetheless, and 60s, but nonetheless, it was still, involved in Britain's dirty wars around the world. And, we saw that as well in the Tony Blair years when Tony Blair was in power.
War,
the Iraq War,
most
infamously.
famously.
Yeah. So, Corbyn represented a rupture with that, you see, and which was a large part of the reason why, it's the main reason why he was such a threat to the British deep state and the British establishment.
Yeah, especially because, I remember the beginning when he first joined the race for the leadership of the Labour Party. In the very beginning, I remember that he was kind of treated with condescension or even laughed at, but it took a very little while, for the smears to start. And during the leadership, the first run, there wasn't much of. There were obvious accusations that he participated in meetings about peace in Palestine, mainly. So that was the beginning of the anti-Semitism smears. But I think that at the beginning he took the establishment quite by surprise, because he's doesn't quite fit the frame of what the consultancy class portrays, as what a politician that generates enthusiasm, especially in the youth, should look like. He's an elderly, mild man, decent, definitely. That's, but he's not young, he's not hippie. He doesn't use very, how can I say, the cultural spectacle. He's not part of that. He doesn't.
He wasn't part of this kind of Oxbridge elite education clique, which in British politics, there's this kind of cult of what's called PPE, which is you go to an elite university, mostly Oxford or Cambridge, and you get a degree in PPE, which is this stupid jargon for politics, philosophy, and economics. And many of the leading politicians have got this degree. And, you start off in student politics, you go on to right-wing student politics, you go on to do your PPE degree, you come out in a blue suit and you get elected, you get a safe seat in the Labour Party, and then, you hope to rise up in the ranks of the party and become a shadow minister and ultimately a cabinet minister. So there was this whole kind of train of politics, of elite politics represented by the Labour Party, which in 2015 Corbyn disrupted. Yeah, he's very different from that. He doesn't fit that image, which was a large part of his popular appeal. Indeed. was that he wasn't in that image. He was not part of this kind of corrupted elite, essentially.
Yeah, and on that, well, first of all, I wasn't aware, of this, let's call it excursus honorum, as the, in the Roman Empire, there was this thing called the excursus honorum, by which, members of the elite had a sort of path, so first you are consul, then you are, all these things, then they could the more important places. And I wasn't aware of this. And in light of this, all the Oxford smears, the environment at Oxford University that you talk about in the book gets a new light, because, obviously I wasn't aware of it. So I thought, okay, so that's quite vicious, but it was, it's also about let's say forming or influencing future generations. But before we start, looking on the attacks, I thought, tell me if I'm wrong, but there was a sort of unholy alliance between the Blairites and the Zionist lobby.
Yeah.
I believe that anti-Semitism was the weapon of choice to take down Corbyn, but the hatred towards him were far more, vast.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there was this kind of ad hoc alliance between the British establishment, the British media, the right wing of the Labour Party, and the Israel lobby, pro-Israel groups, the Zionist movement, however we want to understand it. They all kind of worked together. And it was the Israel lobby's, as you say, weapon of choice to use these false smears of anti-Semitism, because they've been doing this for many decades against their enemies, against opponents to Israel's crimes in Palestine and critics of Israel in the West. And, they'd been doing that kind of thing against Corbyn for a long time, before he became this national figure. When he was a backbencher and a campaigner, they were smearing him as anti-Semitic and all this kind of stuff, as they do to all their enemies. And so what happened was the Israel lobby ended up providing an incredibly powerful political weapon, weaponized anti-Semitism, to deploy against the left and deploy against anyone who is critical of the actions of Israel, and deploy against anyone who it just gets used very widely as against the wider left in general, So it's something that has just become an incredibly useful political weapon. It's not going to be dropped, because it's just so useful for such a wide array of forces. Everybody from the right wing of the Labour Party to the Conservative Party to even the fascist right has begun now taking up this weapon and saying that the left are the quote unquote real racists because they're anti-Semitic.
Yes. And, in that thing, there's something that frightens me a lot, is that, well, there are several things, sadly, that frightens me a lot. But the fact that there's been this, let's say, this focus on specificity of racism and discrimination. Anti-Semitism, which is obviously dreadful. There's no need to say that. But in the larger discourse, at least here in Italy, it seems that is socially unacceptable. But in the meanwhile, different forms of racism, especially Islamophobia, which is virulent, at least here in Italy, and within mainstream politics. I don't know if you're familiar with the Italian politics, these political parties. There's the Lega, which are really racist. Dreadfully racist.
Yeah.
And Islamophobe. And, it has made other targets of discrimination as if they were minor victims.
That's right. Yeah.
It's dreadful. Especially because, this kind of mentality is taking traction. And also the fact that, there's this equivalence, especially with the IR, the definition of anti-Semitism, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, that equates, anti-Zionism, which is, I mean, it's just a decent approach to anti-colonization, so equates that with anti-Semitism. And that also allows, there's this wave. I don't know if you have noticed, but there's a wave of extreme right-wing politicians in Europe that whenever they get elected, the first thing they do, it's a trip to Israel, where wearing a kippah, they go there, they go to the wall, and they do a photo op, and then they express their support for Israel and the right to exist. Let's not talk about that now, but and then they get this patent of not racist or not fascist. Right now, the current Italian government, they are technically fascist. I mean, the chairman of the Senate has in his house, and he has admitted it, a statue of Mussolini, the Italian dictator. But the first thing he did, as soon as he was elected chairman of the Senate, he did a trip to Israel, and then he said, no, see, I can't be fascista because I've been to Israel, and it's dangerous because also equating fascism and Nazism with anti-Semitism. I mean, it's a specificity. It's not the target that it's defines what those ideologies are. It's the concept.
Yeah, absolutely. So two things. First of all, on the issue of anti-Semitism and other types of racism, I would say, yes, it's the same in Britain, as you described, that anti-Semitism is considered to be career-ending in a way that other forms of racism are not. So, yeah, there's a lot of Islamophobia here too, but also just anti-Black racism and things like that. We've seen it in the British Labour Party, whereby there was an inquiry commissioned by the Labour Party not long after Jeremy Corbyn was stood down as the leader of the Labour Party into a leaked report. And long story short, but the report did find that there was examples of racism, anti-Black racism and Islamophobia that just weren't being addressed in the party, and that there was, quote unquote, a hierarchy of racism whereby Labour members perceived that reports of anti-Semitism were being privileged, essentially, and being treated in a way that other forms of racism were not. And what we've seen in reality as well is that even the anti-Semitism that's been alleged is more often than not, 99 cases out of 100, or even 99.9% of the cases are not anti-Semitism. They're actually, as you say, anti-Zionism, opposition to Israel and its foundational ideology.
Yeah.
And yeah.
No, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so there's that whole aspect, and I forget now. I forget my second point. What was the second thing you were talking about?
No, how right-wingers go to Israel.
That's right. Yeah, we're seeing this increasingly. This is really becoming an international phenomenon. It's a kind of get out of jail free card, where we've seen, like, we see it all the time now. Just the latest example that I saw today was there's this American researcher, Moss Robinson, who's really an expert on the Ukrainian far right, and he found there's that in I believe it's in Canada, certainly in North America, but there's this small group which claims to be a Jewish organization, although apparently the person leading it is not Jewish himself. But nonetheless, it's an organization that is in the name of Jewish people, and that is pro-Ukrainian far right, and their defense as well. So he was replying to a tweet about a group called the OUNB, which is this Ukrainian far right. I mean, it's an Ukrainian Nazi group essentially, which was historically, which was literally a collaborator with Hitler's Nazis during the Holocaust and helped Hitler annihilate Ukrainian Jews.
Bandera, yes.
Yeah, Bandera, exactly, who's this kind of national hero in Ukraine. The OUNB, but the defense of the OUNB in this case was, well, they're not anti-Semitic because they're very pro-Israel. And we see this all the time now. The Azov battalion has received arms from Israel, for example, arms and training from Israel. And it's become a global phenomenon. And as you say, it really misses the point. It doesn't stop. Yes, of course, anti-Semitism was really foundational to the Nazis. But although Mussolini, other forms of fascism were not necessarily, anti-Semitism wasn't necessarily central to their ideology. It wasn't central to Italian fascism in the same way, as I'm sure you know, in the same way as the Nazis, although obviously they did.
They joined in.
They joined in, absolutely. There was anti-Semitism for sure because they were working under the Nazis, but it wasn't foundational to the fascist ideology in the same way as Nazism specifically. So absolutely, these groups can be fascist and racist against other people, and then the scapegoats can be someone else instead of Jews, and it often is, as you know, immigrants and all kinds of other marginalized groups. Yeah.
Yes, because for instance, I was thinking about there are several polls that are made all across Europe concerning racism and discrimination, and anti-Semitism. It's hardly a major form of racism. Usually, the main people in Europe who are target of racism are the Roma and Sinti people, then the Slavs, obviously not in the good way, but African migrants, Arabs, then the Slavs, and so on. Anti-Semitism comes at last. No form of discrimination should exist, and I'm not saying that is not, it's fine if there are just a few instances, but if the focus is a specificity rather than discrimination, you're not helping, because that's it. And also, going back to your book and the anti-Semitism, the weaponizing of anti-Semitism, it wasn't just Corbyn that has been targeted, but also all his political allies and a lot of real activists. It's hard for me to say activists. Allow me this small parenthesis, because in these days with the cultural spectacle, people are activists is used for marketing purposes by actors and famous people. They go there, do a Photoshop, and that's an activist. No, true people, people who do real actions. And I was thinking about Jackie Walker, has been a victim of this, and besides the fact that she's Jewish herself. Could you talk a bit about that, that atmosphere, what was going on then, please?
Yeah. And I think this is a really good point. And I think that this is a large part of the reason why the campaign of weaponized anti-Semitism against Corbyn was so successful. As you mentioned a bit earlier, there was straight away the campaign started against Jeremy Corbyn in the summer of 2015, when he first ran for the leadership of the Labour Party. Running to get the votes of the Labour members and supporters. It started up straight away, and it was the pro-Israel media anti-Palestinian newspaper calling itself the Jewish Chronicle, which really provided this weapon to the wider media, which of course was already hostile to him because of the reasons I mentioned earlier of the change in political climate from the neoliberal consensus. And it just started off slowly, and it just continued on and on and on for the whole 4 years until it was just a completely manic drumbeat, and it just really destroyed the whole left. And that's the state we've reached to. And the reason why it was so successful is because it didn't only focus on Corbyn as an individual, because, you know, trying to convince the wider electorate and the wider movement behind Corbyn that he was a racist when everybody knew his track record of anti-racism was not going to fly. So what they had to do was to target the people around Corbyn, the people who were his close allies, like Ken Livingstone, people like figures with a activist who you mentioned, like Jackie Walker, who have this platform and who were key to the movement. Left the very small minority of Labour MPs who were actually left-wing, like Chris Williamson. These people were all targeted and singled out one by one and taken down politically one by one. And, you know, it was a mistake. It was a tactical and strategic, and even you could say moral error of Corbyn and his team that these people were not defended. Because ultimately it meant that when it came to the point of kicking Jeremy Corbyn out of the party, none of those people were left to defend him.
Yeah, you know, when it was happening, and well, especially when I saw the Al Jazeera documentary, The Lobby, I thought, okay, first they came for Ken Livingstone, then they came for Jackie Walker, and then they started going after old ladies, really, you know, smearing, and also, you know, I believe, maybe I'm wrong, but I believe that let's say the rank and file members, they weren't part of the new way that they have been attacked. They weren't part of this new wave of Labour Party members that joined after Corbyn got, started running and then got elected. But they were historical, members of the party.
Well, it was a complicated process. I mean, overall, around about 200,000 people joined the Labour Party essentially to vote for Corbyn because he was so different in between 2015 and 2016. All of those people have now been driven out of the party in one way or another, either expelled or just left in despair. And the media did cover this phenomenon quite a lot, you know, at the height of Corbynism, as you could call it. They covered it quite a lot, but they tended to focus on the young part of this new wave of people joining the Labour Party. When in fact, you know, as you've alluded to, a good number of the people joining the Labour Party to vote for Corbyn were actually rejoining the Labour Party after having perhaps been still technically members, but inactive, or that they'd left during the Tony Blair years because of the state that the party was in, because it was just so disheartening, and that internal democracy in the party had been hollowed out and gutted. And just because of the policies where the Tony Blair governments, the new Labour governments were going towards in favour of war and privatisation.
Besides, I know it may sound as a joke, but I don't think it's a joke that, you know, New Labour looks a lot like old Tory. So it's not as if, but also, I was wondering, do you think that from the, let's say, Blairite side of the Labour Party, and I mean, you know, those who want to be representative, not of the working class, but of the professional class, do you think that there was also sort of a classism towards this, you know, at least the younger members who have joined? Because, you know, I remember, you know, I thought it was quite nice people singing at the stadium, or chanting Corbyn's name as people do in stadiums.
Yeah.
And was it looked upon us as if, let's say, in a sort of way of what Hillary Clinton would describe as deplorables?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. There was a lot of snobbery from the Labour Party staff, the Labour Party bureaucrats, who were, I mean, look, Corbyn was the leader of the Labour Party. He was elected overwhelmingly twice, but he never got control of the bureaucracy. There was, these were essentially the internal civil servants of the Labour Party. And they, not only did they not help him, they actively sabotaged him. And we know from leaked internal Labour Party communications, mostly WhatsApp chats, which were leaked first of all, in the Labour Party, the leaked Labour Party report on alleged anti-Semitism in the party, which came out in 2020, and I mentioned some of it in my book. But we know from a lot of those logs that they absolutely despised the membership. And there was one communication in those logs which said something along the lines of, the worst thing that ever happened in the Labour Party was giving members a say. And they're openly saying this. They see the Labour Party membership as this kind of drone army, essentially, which should just every 4 years should just accept marching orders of where to deliver a few leaflets and then just go back home and be quiet.
Mm-hmm. Giving them for granted also, especially because it's not as if neoliberal policies provide anything for the average person.
And the Corbynist movement represented a complete change from that. It represented a threat of bringing popular movements and mass participation into the Labour Party, whereas Labour Party elites just want this kind of technocratic, neoliberal, professional class to just decide and run things. And that's how things are now going again in the Labour Party under Keir Starmer.
Yeah. And, well, I know that we're going a bit back and forwards, but it's also the style of your book, you talk about what was happening in a certain time frame, and then you go back to give more context. And that's also very fascinating and gripping for election. So, well, there are two major points that I believe are important. Also to create, an atmosphere hostile to Corbyn. And, well, one obviously were Corbyn's response, but perhaps we could talk later on that. But secondly, there are what I call, let's say, false allies. I mean, people who are perceived by the general public to be allied of Corbyn or on the left. And, well, on the other hand, they may be more of a liberal, let's say, persuasion. And I believe that liberalism is a right-wing ideology. So, and, specifically, I'm talking about Owen Jones and The Guardian in general, but also Novara Media, who there's a note in your book in which Aaron Bastani of Novara Media, when talking about Jackie Walker's expulsion, he refuses to consider her Jewish, saying, oh, come on, she's not Jewish. She's Jewish as I am, and I'm not.
Yeah. Yeah, this was part of the whole right-wing narrative against Jackie Walker. And there was, a large amount of racism in this narrative, that the subtext, and I'm not saying this was necessarily from Aaron Bastani.
Excuse me. No, because a lot of people listening to this may not know who Jackie Walker is. I'll just say it in Italian very briefly, sorry. Jackie Walker è un'attivista del ex Partito Laburista, molto impegnata molto interessata alla questione palestinese, e è nera, Jazeera e ebrea di origine giamaicana. Nel libro, tra l'altro, si parla anche della sua storia e niente, continuo a consigliarlo. Thanks, sorry.
No problem. Yeah, so Jackie Walker, there was this right-wing narrative against her that the subtext of it was essentially that because she's Black, she can't also be Jewish. There's this kind of racist, chauvinist current especially within Zionism, that, but not only in Zionism, but there is this exclusivist current,
Ashkenazi, the
Yeah.
only good,
that only white Jews are the real Jews, essentially. And so there was a lot of racism against Jackie Walker, saying, "Oh no, she can't possibly be Jewish." And unfortunately, whether consciously or not, Aaron Bastani then fed into that by saying that she wasn't a real Jew. And so, unfortunately, we have these kinds of false allies is a really accurate way to put it. That they're another way to think of it would be gatekeepers. That they're the gatekeepers within the mainstream media who dictate the leftmost extreme of the mainstream media, and they sort of portray themselves as these radicals and socialists and so forth. But actually, they're a kind of fake left, which is promoted by the mainstream media, and that does include Novara Media, because Novara Media were given especially during the Corbyn years, not so much now, but because they've outlived their usefulness. But during the Corbyn years, the Novara people were given very regular access to mainstream broadcast media to kind of put forward the Corbynite voice. But when it mattered, they were actually effectively anti-Corbyn, because they were putting forward and buying into this narrative that the Labour Party was endemically anti-Semitic, which was completely untrue. And they now even kind of admit, in a way, in a sort of two-faced way, they say that it wasn't true. But at the time when it mattered, that's the narrative that they were promoting. When this whole anti-Semitism smear campaign really brought down the movement behind Jeremy Corbyn, that is what they were helping to promote. And they're still kind of doing it now, really, because it's become such a wide and divisive issue in British society as a whole, that the entire political left is really being smashed apart, has been smashed apart by this weaponized anti-Semitism. And it's spread to other parts of society. So we see even outside the Labour Party, we see academia, the Professor David Miller, who's an expert, I would say one of the world's leading experts on the Israel lobby. He was sacked from his position at the University of Bristol it wasn't even the reason given, but there was a lot of, technically speaking, it wasn't the reason given, but there was a lot of smears in the press about him, claiming that he was anti-Semitic. But 2 investigations by a barrister, a very senior lawyer for the University of Bristol, found him to be not guilty of anti-Semitism, and that he was an opponent of Israel, an opponent of Zionism. But nonetheless, he was sacked. And he's taking that to an employment tribunal later this year, and hopefully he'll get a good result out of that, but we'll have to wait and see. But also, the elected president of the National Union of Students was removed by executive fiat from her elected position, because she is an opponent of Israeli apartheid and Israeli crimes against the Palestinians. And also, it has to be said, there's a large degree of Islamophobia in her removal, because she is a visibly Muslim woman who wears a hijab. So a large part of the smear campaign against her was just, Islamophobia. So we see this weaponized anti-Semitism really spreading from the Labour Party to wider society.
I was wondering, specifically in the chapter, The Jew and the Unjew, I believe is chapter 6, you talk about, how let's say, well, the definition, the that definition, sorry.
IHRA, yeah.
Yes, sorry. Wasn't, well, hadn't been accepted yet. And, but people already, let's say, formally started describe anti-Zionism. And let's remember that the majority of Zionists aren't even Jews, because think about all the Christians in the US who are hardcore Zionists.
Yeah.
And, you know, let's say the idea of the offense of anti-Semitism was given to the perception, you know, somebody felt offended. So they described it as an anti-Semitic, they described, let's say, calls for Palestine liberation as anti-Semitic because they perceived it as such. So by definition, it was anti-Semitic. And that, you know, while on the other hand, racist and actually anti-Semitic remarks, especially we talked about the example of Jackie Walker, weren't considered anti-Semitic. So do you think that this perception of, let's say, the focus of the individual rather than the structural, it's part of, you know, the shifting in the wider discourse of, you know, let's say, shifting from the social and structural aspect to the individualistic, individual and individualistic aspects? You know, would you think that it makes sense or not?
Yeah, I do. I think that was a large part of the reason of why this weaponized anti-Semitism campaign was so successful. I think that's a good way to put it, the focus on individual feelings rather than on the structural reality. So this is something that the Israel lobby and Zionists in particular are very good at doing that, and especially in the last few years have become very skillful in operating as a political weapon, which is the idea that, well, I'm a Jew, I say it's anti-Semitic, therefore ipso facto it is anti-Semitic, with no regard to objective political realities or material facts. So ignoring structural issues such as what the reality of Zionism means for Palestinians, for example, and that it means that, you know, as we record this, the Zionist state, the state that calls itself the state of all the Jews in the world, even though it's not, that is to say the state of Israel, is invading the Jenin refugee camp and killing Palestinians and expelling Palestinians from their homes. So that is the reality of Zionism. But the Israel lobby and pro-Israel campaigners in the West want to deceive us into thinking that Zionism is a kind of quote unquote identity that you have to respect, and that you have to, you know, it's about, you know, what you're saying hurts my feelings, and that it's a personal identity. Well, it's not a personal identity. It's a real political movement which has very real material consequences for people all around the world, people in Palestine, and we can now say for people in Britain who have been denied Jeremy Corbyn as a prime minister in large part because of the Israel lobby.
Indeed. And well, also, you know, I mean, the focus on identity and identity politics also allows, you know, the rebranding, well, the tentative rebranding of Israel as, you know, this progressive state, because it, you know, says, oh, we have gay people in our army and so on.
Yeah, pink washing. There's all kinds of different washings that they try and do to distract from the reality of what it means to have a Jewish state in Palestine, a country which is overwhelmingly historically and currently not Jewish, that you have to impose a form of what the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem describes as Jewish supremacy on the whole country. And to do that, you have to, and to maintain support from the West, you have to distract from those crimes with all these kinds of identity politics, whereby you say, or just distracting from the issue, whereby you say things like, oh, well, look at all the technological advancements that we've brought to the region and things like that, which is by and large.
Sorry, go ahead.
But it's by and large mostly not true anyway. But yeah, it's kind of like the white man's burden. I think that's what you were going to say.
Yes, indeed. Also, I would like to quote Professor Joseph Massad when he points out that actually Zionism is an anti-Semitic idea. The idea that Zionism is embraced by all Jews is anti-Semitic, because it considers Jews as a monolith rather than individual free thinkers. However, sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. And also just the very concept of Zionism is that Jews are not Europeans. Jews do not belong in the countries in which they are born, and the countries in which they and all their ancestors probably lived. They do not belong in these countries, and they are actually quote unquote foreigners who are from the Middle East. That they're somehow mystically they're from Palestine, from the far past, just essentially because of what religious books say. Well, that is something that the Nazis thought too. The Nazis thought that Jews are not German. They're not German, and so they should therefore be expelled to Palestine.
And I'll take this opportunity to quote, because, well, obviously in the book you talk about it concerning Ken Livingstone expulsion after his interview at the radio, but you quote this book, The Third Reich, and the Palestine question, which we will put in the links below, after the conversation, because there have been, obviously, it's a historical fact that there have been contacts between the Nazi regime and the early Zionists. So it's an important reference book. Obviously, this doesn't mean, there's no need here to do the, let's say, premises, because we know that we are anti-fascist, anti-racist, and so on. So I was starting, saying the usual things like, obviously, this doesn't mean that we support the idea that it's Nazi, they are the descendants of Nazis, and so on. They are colonialist enterprise, Zionists.
Yeah, Zionism is a settler colonial enterprise, which predates Nazism, really. It's it's a complicated history, and I have a whole chapter on it in the book. And there were contacts between the German Zionist movement, especially, and the Nazi government, and they cooperated in certain ways because they, as I mentioned, they saw this kind of affinity between their ideologies, and that they both agreed that German Jews weren't really German and they should live in Palestine, and that before the Holocaust, that was the Nazi plan, was to remove German Jews and to settle them elsewhere, primarily in Palestine.
The beginning, I believe there was a plan in Morocco.
Yeah, there were different plans, but the one that was finally settled on was Palestine, and there was this Ha'avara, or transfer agreement, which facilitated that, which is fairly well known and very well documented. But there were also other things which are less well known, which are documented in that book by Francis Nicosia, which you mentioned, the Third Reich and Palestine. There were other things. So the Nazi government in the early 30s began aiding the Zionist movement, helping them to set up a series of what were called re-education camps to retrain German Jews in agricultural techniques to prepare them for their new life as settlers in Palestine. Well, the vast majority of German Jews and the vast majority of Jews in the world in general were not Zionists. They were opposed to Zionism. Zionism was at the time very much a minority trend among the world's Jewish population. And they weren't interested in becoming settlers in Palestine. And they had to be really driven there almost by force in a lot of ways. And so, we see the material reality of these affinities and cooperations that happened between the far right and Zionism historically. And as we mentioned earlier, still now today, where you have the far right forces, especially in Europe, but also in America, getting a kind of get out of jail free card of, well, saying, well, we're not anti-Semitic, we're pro-Israel. That does not follow at all.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Now, going back to I know that we're going a bit back and forward, and I don't want to take too much of your time. Just a few more questions, if you can.
Sure.
Something that I believe was quite disappointing, at least for me, but also for other people, is the way in which Corbyn responded or not responded to these attacks, because he, I don't know if he was quite passive, let's say so. Also, especially in the lack of defense for his allies who were being targeted.
Yeah, it was a great missed opportunity, really. I mean, Corbyn is from this kind of English radical tradition of almost Christian pacifism, although, I mean, I think he's technically neither a Christian nor a pacifist, but nonetheless, he comes from this kind of tradition, and that was very much his whole, for want of a better word, vibe. And that was, to be fair, that was a large part of his appeal, that he was this kind of, it was from this English radical tradition, and it is a popular tradition, albeit buried one. And he is a peaceful guy, and he's in the anti-war movement. But it got to the point of his detriment, whereby he was not responding at all to this campaign. He did not respond in any kind of effectual way, and he kind of tried to ultimately to sweep it under the rug, and he didn't defend his allies, and it was a major problem. His only response really was to say, we condemn anti-Semitism, and he kept coming out with these public statements saying that he condemned anti-Semitism. Well, now, who could disagree with that? Of course, we all condemn anti-Semitism, but the problem is when you say that, when that's your response to a false allegation of anti-Semitism, which is actually a political accusation by your political enemies to misrepresent you as anti-Semitic, then if that's your response to say we condemn anti-Semitism, you're then giving the impression that the original allegation was true and correct, and that, for example, what Ken Livingstone said actually was anti-Semitic, and, for example, what Chris Williamson said and Jackie Walker said was anti-Semitic, even if you're not directly commenting on that, which was often the case with Corbyn. You're giving that impression, and that's damaging. That's damaging to the movement. It's damaging to solidarity, and ultimately it was damaging to Corbyn himself, because these were the people around him, the people who got him where he was, and he didn't support them. And when it came to remove him from the party, there was no one left to defend him.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. And I believe that also he to the electorate, he showed that he projected the image of someone who wouldn't stand his ground.
Exactly. Yeah.
So
yeah, this is a really key point, that it was damaging to the electorate, because it showed that so a big part of his appeal was that he was, like we've said, that he was a different kind of politician, that he wasn't like all these kind of drones in suits with their PPE degrees, that he was somebody from the mass movements and that he was going to be honest and stick to his guns. But when he's kind of, what he ended up doing was then kind of flip-flopping on this issue and not standing by his allies and standing by his comrades, it showed that it added to that kind of effect of, well, maybe he's just as bad as the others kind of thing. And it was a real problem.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So post Corbyn, I mean, the Labour Party is what it is with Keir Starmer, who's quite, let's say that unpleasant, to be mild. But I've noticed that in the general British society, I mean, I've seen it with my family, who's from London, and there is a kind of thirst for something, for a true left. Like I saw also the response that the union leader Mick Lynch got when he, in difference to Corbyn, he wasn't polite to the smears and attacks, and well, there were mainly classist attacks, but he got quite some attention.
Yeah.
What's the state of now of the left in the UK?
Well, it's completely dire. I mean, I think that unless something radically changed, and that things like that can happen, as Corbyn shows, it came out of nowhere, Corbynism. But unless we get something like that comes out of the blue, I think the British left is defeated for a generation, because it's just been smashed to smithereens, and there's a big appetite for something new and different. There's a big appetite. There's a massive gap. 200,000 people have been kicked out of the Labour Party, or effectively kicked out, driven out of the Labour Party. Those people could form, the core of a new political party, which could still be led by Jeremy Corbyn. Now, it wouldn't get very far electorally. It would have maybe one MP at best. Corbyn could win as an independent and start a new political party. But does he have the will to do it? Does he have the political will? Does he have the energy to do it? He's in his 70s now. I don't know. I'm not sure that he does, because he never, I don't think he's ever really fully recovered from these attacks, which he took personally and failed to understand, it seems to me, that this was not personal to him, that it was the same kind of attack that the Israel lobby carries out against the entire, anyone it considers its enemies. So really the left as a whole, except for those parts it can co-opt and neutralize, and anyone who's even supportive of Palestinian rights in any kind of way. So it was inevitable that this kind of thing was going to happen. But he, nonetheless, there's still a great deal of goodwill for him on a popular level in this country. And I think, if he was to do that, lots of people would rally behind him, and there could be a new moment, and there could, you can envision a scenario where he decides enough is enough and he's going to start fighting back. And I think people would be surprised at the advances that a new political party like that could carry out.
I look forward for a future where the Blairite Labour Party becomes the PASOK in Greek, the Greek PASOK. So
yeah,
but also I believe that the anti-Semitism accusation of anti-Semitism were also useful, especially to the Blairite faction, so that the center of the discourse of the narrative was focused on that rather than on the policies.
Yeah, absolutely. This is what happened. Corbyn's policies were incredibly popular with the electorate, when he was able to talk about them. But unfortunately, most of the time he was distracted by this weaponized anti-Semitism and wasn't able to talk about it.
Okay. Well, a last question, if I may. Besides what, the UK situation and the accusation of anti-Semitism, I believe that we can't ignore what is happening right now in Palestine, because in the last weeks we've seen an escalation of the oppressions, like the pogroms, the killing of kids, well, that has occurred, and yesterday's invasion of the Jenin camp. Since you are an expert on this issue, would you mind to talk a little bit about that?
Yes, well, what's happened, in a nutshell, what's happened is that Jenin, the Jenin refugee camp in the north of the West Bank, has become a center and a base for resistance to the Israeli occupation forces over the last couple of years, especially. And the whole population of that refugee camp, tens of thousands of people, men, women, and children, civilians, are being collectively punished because they dare to stand up to the Israeli occupation forces. And that's what is happening. And beginning yesterday, in the early hours of yesterday, there was a massive invasion of the Jenin refugee camp by Israeli occupation forces, unprecedented since the infamous Jenin massacre of 2002. You watch the videos from it and you always hear constantly the constant hum of drones circling the camp, as we're familiar with from the Gaza Strip. That is the daily life of the people in Gaza. And so what's happening is that Israel is trying to besiege and is besieging the Jenin refugee camp and is trying to turn it into a new Gaza to punish the people of Jenin for supporting the resistance to the Israeli occupation and to Israeli settler colonialism, to apartheid, to a racist government which discriminates against them, which expels them simply for the crime of, quote unquote, crime of not being Jewish, because Israel at the end of the day is, as I mentioned earlier, what B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights group, calls a Jewish supremacist regime between the Mediterranean Sea and the River Jordan. So this in a nutshell is what's happening. The civilian population is being punished because there's people who stand up to the Israeli occupation forces, and they use arms to do so. They use arms to defend themselves and to defend themselves from Israeli colonialism. That's what's happening. Yeah.
And also, I believe it's important, the destruction of the infrastructure that's taking place, because the materials for reconstructions are blocked. They can't reach the camps. So it's a long-term collective punishment. I mean,
yeah, so we've seen, I was reading reports about it today of what's happening in the camp. So there's been, as well as attacking people and killing people, as at least 8 people have been killed so far as of yesterday, probably far more now today, but 3,000 people have been evacuated from the camp. So the civilian population is being effectively expelled from their homes by the Israeli military operation. And there is, as you mentioned, there is systematic destruction of the civilian infrastructure of the camp by Israeli occupation forces. In other words, a war crime. That is a war crime under international law. That's the deliberate destruction of civilian infrastructure. So the water has been cut off in the camp, in large parts of the camp, as I understand it. That destruction of civilian infrastructure is a war crime. And also we've seen these videos of Israeli army bulldozers deliberately tearing up the roads within the camp. Yeah. Again, civilian infrastructure being vandalized by Israeli occupation criminals, a war crime.
Yes, indeed. Okay, Asa, I would like to thank you. I've already took too much of your time. So nothing. I would just like to really thank you for this fascinating conversation, and I hope that perhaps in the future we could also have another one.
Thank you very much for having me. My pleasure.